If you want to make your iPhone footage look more cinematic, you have to mainly follow 5 steps. The right camera settings, cinematic lighting, the right techniques when you shoot your clips, for example camera movements or a good stabilization, a few tricks in post-production, that is when editing the video, and a cinematic color grading. Today I will explain the most important principles to all these aspects in a simple way, so that you can easily create a cinematic film look with your iPhone. So let's start with the first step. That is the right camera settings on your iPhone. For optimal video quality, I would basically recommend that you set it to the best possible resolution, which would be 4K. When it comes to cinematic footage, the frame rate is also very important. In professional movies, a low frame rate of 24 frames per second is generally used. Such a frame rate does make the footage look less fluid than, for example, a shot taken with 30 or 60 frames per second. However, your eyes have long since become accustomed to this look. A shot taken with 30 frames per second therefore looks smoother but not as cinematic. In some cases, it can be useful to use a higher frame rate of 60 frames per second. If you shoot at 60 frames per second, you can create a slow motion of 40%, as I did here in this shot. This can also create a very cinematic effect. Slow motion also has the advantage of adding additional stabilization to the footage. Basically though, I would only recommend shooting in 4K 60 if you really want to create slow motion. Shooting in 4K 60 requires more storage space and creates more compression artifacts. When performing camera moves, you should also lock the exposure and the focus on the iPhone. This is easily done by tapping and holding on the screen. And this will prevent your iPhone from adjusting the focus or the exposure during your shot. You can use the sun icon to adjust exposure a bit, making the image a bit brighter or darker. For a cinematic look, it would also be important that your shutter speed, that is the exposure time for the individual frames, is exactly twice as high as the frame rate. At 24 frames per second, that would be a shutter speed of 1/48 or 1/50th. This is the only way to create enough motion blur. If the shutter speed is too high, which is usually the case in daylight, there is a lack of motion blur. With the standard camera app, however, it is not possible to set the shutter speed manually. For this, you need an additional app, for example Filmic Pro. In daylight, a low shutter speed usually leads to overexposure, and you need ND filters to let less light in. Such ND filters are available for the iPhone, for example from Polar Pro, but similar to shots taken in low light, the electronic stabilization of your iPhone will suffer. In summary, for a perfect cinematic shot, the shutter speed should be exactly twice as high as the frame rate. But for that, you need an additional app and ND filters if you shoot in daylight. The electronic stabilization will also work worse. So there are advantages and disadvantages. With the iPhone 12, HDR Dolby Vision was introduced. This allows your iPhone to display very bright areas in the image, such as light sources, much brighter. This makes the image look much more realistic. However, you also need an HDR capable display, what the iPhone's display naturally is. However, this is still not the case with most monitors and displays. For this reason, you can also deactivate Dolby Vision for our purposes today. You can already find detailed tutorials on this topic and also on the topic of the best video settings for the iPhone on my channel. Check them out if you want to know even more about it. Let's move on to our second step, a cinematic lighting. I could tell you a lot about cinematic studio lighting, 3-point lighting, softboxes and so on. But the fact is, you probably won't be using professional lighting equipment for your iPhone video recordings. In most cases, that wouldn't make much sense either. Rather, you'll be working exclusively with natural light in most cases. There are a few important principles to keep in mind. In most cases, your shots will look more cinematic if you take them in soft light. You can find such light just before sunset or after sunrise, during the so-called golden hour, or also shortly after sunset or before sunrise, during the blue hour. Even if it's cloudy, the clouds can serve as a large softbox, softening the light. Clouds can also add drama to your scene. If you're shooting indoors with your iPhone, you could use the window as a large light source. Curtains could soften the light coming in. What you should avoid are ceiling lights. They lead to unsightly shadows and the shot will not look cinematic. You will also hardly be able to create a cinematic shot in harsh sunlight and at noon. The sun leads to unsightly shadows and the general scene is very brightly lit. Many movies also prefer a rather dark lighting of the scene. All of these are just a few important basics though. When it comes to lighting, you should also ask yourself what mood you want to convey. The mood of a cheerful travel video or a more dramatic mood. This should also guide your choice of lighting. You now have your iPhone set up correctly and have chosen the right time of day for your shot, or basically the right lighting situation. Then we come to the third step, the actual shooting. For the shot itself, there are again several aspects you should consider for a cinematic look. composition, camera movement, stabilization, and sometimes you can also create a blurred background. Composition is a very extensive topic, and just like in photography, it is a science of its own when it comes to filmmaking. Today, I simply want to encourage you to give some thought to whether your image composition is optimal as you have chosen it, or whether there might be a better solution before you shoot. Some of the same principles apply as in photography. Although when shooting video, you may want to pay even more attention to what story you are trying to tell. Often it can be useful to place objects in the foreground. In combination with camera movements, this can add a lot of depth to the shot. And that brings us to the second aspect, camera movements. You can enhance many of your iPhone shots with camera movements and make them look more cinematic. For the beginning, I would recommend a few very simple movements. A very simple but very effective movement is, for example, the dolly forward. Here you simply move straight forward with your iPhone. This immediately makes the shot look more dynamic and cinematic. Also simple and effective is a lateral movement, making sure you don't just turn your iPhone from left to right, but actually move it from side to side. This makes a huge difference. In the same way, you can also move your iPhone upwards and create what's called a revealing shot. These are very simple movements to begin with, but they make a huge difference and often look much more cinematic than fancy camera movements. Always make sure to move your iPhone as stable as possible. As you can see, I often use a smartphone gimbal. I'm not saying it's always necessary, especially when you use the ultrawide lens. The image is already superbly stabilized. Still, the gimbal can be an advantage, especially for longer movements. If you don't want to use a gimbal, then I recommend at least a simple hand grip. Such a hand grip makes it much easier to create camera movements. If you are interested in what gimbal and accessories I use for my iPhone, check out the links in the video description. With the iPhone, it is actually possible to create a shallow depth of field as well. A shallow depth of field is used extremely often in movies and therefore looks very cinematic to us. With the iPhone, you should use the standard lens or even the telephoto lens for this. You should get as close as possible to your subject, and the background should be as far away as possible. If you follow these rules, you can also create a blurred background or foreground with your iPhone without any artificial effects. After we have taken our shots, we import them into the editing program. I use Final Cut Pro 10 myself, but what I'm going to say today works the same way with any other editing software. What's very important is that we create a project with 24 frames per second. As I mentioned earlier, a low frame rate creates that cinematic look. Also, we either shot our footage at 24 frames per second or want to slow it down to 24 frames per second. After we import our clips onto the timeline, we put them in the right order and cut them to the music, for example, depending on the situation and the project. I would now add a letterbox effect to the video. This effect gives your footage a new wider format. This is just a small step, but it makes an extremely big difference. Again, because we are just used to seeing movies in this wide format. You can still move the position of your clip up or down. This letterbox effect also has disadvantages, and sometimes it can be an advantage if you already create your project in a wider format. For YouTube, for example, I could recommend you a format of 2:1. This way, after exporting, you will get a video that already has a widescreen format, another video with the usual 16:9 format, which only has black bars at the top and bottom. The last step to our cinematic iPhone clip is the color grading. It's obvious that you can add the letterbox effect after color grading, what's probably even more appropriate. Today, I want to briefly show you how I quickly and easily make the colors of the iPhone footage look a bit more cinematic. This is not going to be a detailed color grading tutorial. I'm also not going to try to sell you some LUTs. Rather, I'll show you a few quick and easy steps to a cinematic look. Again, the tools for color grading actually work the same in any editing program. The iPhone footage already has a very contrasty and saturated look. Still, I'm going to add some more contrast and make the image a little darker. For this, I will use the curves. The upper areas represent the bright areas in the image, the lower ones the darker areas. I mainly make the dark areas a little darker and brighten the bright areas slightly. The result is a somewhat strange S-curve. This step alone already makes this big difference. Now I added the colors. I will first slightly change individual colors. You can do that with these hue and saturation curves. I'll pull the blue very slightly towards teal and also the green slightly upwards. Even more important is to desaturate single colors. For this I use this hue versus saturation curve. I especially pull the saturation of blue and green down. Please remember, there is not the one film look. This is really just an example for a quick cinematic color grading. Finally, we give our image a green cast. This is also quite typical for many movies. For this, I use the color wheels. I work mainly on the dark and bright areas of the image and thus pull the wheels of the highlights and shadows in the direction of green. I tend not to touch the midtones. also because the skin tones are usually located here. Here you can see the difference we created in color grading. It really didn't take much and it looks much more cinematic. There are many different looks you can create in color grading and you can also find thousands of LUTs online. But as you could see today, it's quite easy to create your own look. And that's it for our cinematic look. If you want to see more tutorials, subscribe to the channel, give me a like as feedback if you liked the video, and see you next time.